Hello and welcome, and today I have a very special guest. I am joined all the way from America by Ramsey Meadows from Rajathon. Is it Rajathon or Rajathon?
It's considering a name change, but Rajathon is what I go with now.
You're considering a name change. What are you considering a name change to? Because I'm considering a name change.
I was going to go with epic book summaries or book reviews or something like that.
Right.
Because I have the Epic Summary podcast, which I've done almost nothing with. But if I made the two work close together, I
Yeah.
could do a website. And that was kind of the idea.
I think that makes a lot of sense actually to unify your social media. That was one of the things when I decided, right, I'm going to do Seagulls Gather, that I could get it across all, because nobody else would have that because it's ridiculous. So that nobody else would have it on any of the social media. But what I found was you still can't unify on social media because one will take an underscore and one won't, and one will take a dash and one won't, and one will take a dot and one, and you're just like, the unifying has gone out of the window here, and that was the purpose of this. So that was completely off track. Anyway, I have a feeling this is going to be a fun video, and it might get completely off track quite a lot. But the purpose of the video is that I found this book in a secondhand bookshop. It is a Bloomsbury good reading guide, and it is their 100 must-read science fiction novels. So what I thought would be fun was to find somebody with a shared interest in science fiction and compare how many of these we've read, what we think of the list generally, what we might add to the list if we were creating our list. I'm just going to say, at the risk of reducing my credibility to nothing, how many of these I'd read, and I'm just going to have a quick count because I didn't write down the number. 17 out of 100. That's not great if they're the 100 must-read sci-fi books. How about yourself?
I'm even less than you.
That is a relief at least.
I have 13, yeah.
Oh, I win by almost 25%. That's a landslide.
Now,
So,
if we talked about owning them, I own many, many of these, but actually reading them, I have not. There, you can tell by the piles and piles of books behind me that I own quite a few books. We've got really good, I guess you would call them charity shops. We call them thrift shops
Yeah.
here in the U.S. And I don't really buy new books because they're super expensive. So if I can find it used, I'll buy it used. And a lot of good old sci-fi is just waiting to be picked up.
I am insanely jealous every time I see somebody's book haul of how good your thrift shops are over there for books. Ours are so poor. I've got a really good second-hand bookshop quite near me, but they don't have that high turnover of stock. So it's like I'll go one week and the next week it'll be the same
It's
books.
the same stuff.
Rather than go through the entire list, we're just going to go through the ones that we've read. Okay, and these are initially, I'm going through the list as in the order they're in the book, which is alphabetical. And the first one that I've read, there are two on the list by Isaac Asimov. One is I, Robot, which I haven't read, and the other is Foundation, which I have. And I really don't have a problem with it being on this list. I didn't find it to be, like, it didn't blow me away. It wasn't spectacular that I was just like, I must recommend this to everybody. But I did think that this was a pretty good book and the start of something I liked. The sort of, I almost called it world building, but it's not world building, is it? Because it's much grander than that. And it isn't, and it isn't like Dune, which we'll get to, where there is a very specific world building. It is more, I don't know, how would you describe it?
Well, for me, I've only read Foundation. I haven't read what is it? Second Foundation, and then Foundation and Empire, I think is 2 and 3. But I own them. Found them all at the thrift store, like I was talking about. It felt like 3 different books. It was like really 3 different short stories, where the 3 short stories were given in a linear scenario, but basically you had the initial I can't remember his name right now, and then you had the merchants, which was my favorite part, and then you had the, what was the third part? The third part was pretty good too. The stories were interesting, and the forward thinkingness of how he used math to create a generational relevancy for his people. I thought that was great. I thought the idea was great. Um, but I feel like a lot of times it's put on these lists because of what it did for the genre of science fiction and not so much for the quality of the writing.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you there. And I think that a lot of this stuff for the golden age of science fiction is more about themes and ideas. And that idea of sort of forward planning you see cropping up is like Methuselah's Children by Robert Heinlein, that they're selectively bred through generations to create longer lived human beings. And even like the way I'm going to say Bene Gesserit of Dune, I might be pronouncing it wrong, have been breeding for generations to create their own Messiah, if you like, in Paul. So that idea of sort of planning for a future, I think perhaps it even comes out of the atomic age, like this idea that the people of that era are living under a shadow of expecting World War III. You had World War One, you had World War Two in a really short space of time. When we look back at them now, it's been a long time since we had a World War. Whereas they expected there to be another one, and they expected there to be, people building fallout shelters in their back garden. Like Robert Heinlein actually had a fallout shelter in his own on his property. So people had them. They're where I used to live. Even in the UK, people had them. So they expected this thing to happen. So I think that maybe that idea of like how short-sighted are we to have created this doomsday scenario for ourselves, that the science fiction writers of the time were almost like, wouldn't it be better if we did this? But what's interesting for me is that if you take that as their thinking was, wouldn't it be better if we were planning for the future, is that all of those novels that we've mentioned restrict the gain of that plan to a very select group. It isn't a gain for everybody, even if it's a plan for mankind, if you like. It isn't a gain for all of us.
I think, the idea of what I feel like is a lot of how America was founded. When you kind of look at it, we believe that these people are smart, that these people have a good grasp on leadership, and we want to create a system where these people shape what happens from now on. And then America quickly diverged from that with the Bill of Rights and things like that. I'm reading a lot of presidential biographies, if you can't tell.
Yeah, I've seen that. I haven't seen a lot of your streams, but I've seen that you were doing them, and I thought when you catch up with some of the ones I've heard of, I'm going to get involved. But it's like the history of America is there's too much that I don't even know our kings and queens. You can't expect me to know all your presidents.
Well, I just picked up the next president on the list, number 8, Martin Van Buren, and nobody knows anything about him. They had no idea like who he was, what he did. Even the best biography I found of him is like 178 pages. Like all these other presidents have these monumental biographies, and Martin Van Buren, the best I can get is less than 200 pages. So it's very, very interesting. So if you want me to go ahead and do the next one on the list that I've read, it is the Martian Chronicles, and it was forever and ever ago. But I did want to bring up, I've heard a lot about The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester and The Demolished Man. I have heard quite a few good things about those two books, and they're definitely on my list of books that I want to get to. And then we were both talking about Ian M. Banks. You said that you had read one of his horror novels, and I had read his first science fiction novel, but we have not read the book that they say is the best, The Player of Games, which is book 2 in the Culture series, which is next on my list of his books to read, but neither of us have read that one.
No. In fact, while we're just mentioning some of the authors we're going to skip over to get to Bradbury, I'll mention that Brian Aldiss and James Blish are people whose literary criticism I have read, but I have not ever read anything by them, apart from I did read and have a review of one of Blish's Star Trek novels. And I have this one, The Case of Conscience, is the one that they chose for him in the Bloomsbury must read, and I have had that for quite some time without getting around to reading it yet. But it is on my list. I promise I'll get to it eventually. It's not even that thick. You'd think that in itself would encourage me to read it, but it actually is the tiniest typeface you've ever seen, and I'm thinking I might need a magnifying glass to read it, and that puts me off a little bit as well. But I've heard good things about it, really well regarded. But I do wonder, is because Blish was a famous critic, whether people are like, yeah, Blish wrote a great book, when in fact they're just trying to keep on side because he's the one that's criticizing their books.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we skip on to The Martian Chronicles. You read that a long time ago?
What I remember about it was very dreamlike. When I originally read Princess of Mars, I thought The Martian Chronicles and so I thought Edgar Rice Burroughs and Ray Bradbury were the same person because I had read this book and I was like, we had an older school library. One of the schools that I went to, either in early high school or like between grade 7 and grade 9, somewhere in that area, it used to be a college. And so it had a lot of older books in it that I got a hold of. I found the first Tarzan. I found some stuff like that. So I thought what I had read was Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars series and realized I hadn't. I had read this. And what I remember of it was like fake towns and just dreamy scenes, but I'll have to definitely read it again because I don't remember a ton about it.
I would strongly recommend reading it again if you don't remember it, because it is Ray Bradbury. It has that sort of a very leisurely pace about it, but at the same time, somebody like yourself interested in the history of your nation, I think that there are deliberate parallels between sort of the colonizing of the stars and your own westward expansion, and sort of that pioneering spirit is very much explored. I wouldn't necessarily say 100% complementarily the way it's looked at, but you're right as well about the dreamlike quality of it. There's quite a lot of stuff in there that is like the Martians attempting to communicate through non-vocal means, so through dreams and exploring people's psyches and things like that, and the fact that it is probably quite similar to Edgar Rice Burroughs in its depiction of Mars, because they're both, I think, based on, is it Percival Howell or Howell, who was an astronomer who just invented a load of stuff about Mars, and it was like, it was the best they had, I guess, in terms of what do we think Mars is like. And he was like, oh, there's canals on Mars and things like that. And either he just invented it all, or it was just, he was clutching at straws a little bit. But a lot of science fiction writers, when they wrote about Mars after his work, based their depictions of Mars on that. So things like canals and things like that is a recurring theme, and that's why it comes from him.
Yeah, Princess of Mars had dried up canals with vegetation in the canal system, and then underground seas.
Mm-hmm. Martian Chronicles has dried up. The Martians are pretty much gone. There's like a few of them. I don't want to particularly ruin it for you, but if I did a video, Astounding Science Fiction Sci-Fi Tag, which I tagged you in, by the way.
Okay.
There's just like 8 questions, I think, and one of them was about short stories that I would recommend, and one of the short stories that I recommended was the very last, or the second to last short story that is in the Martian Chronicles, where the house on Earth and like everybody, we've all destroyed ourselves and there's no people left, but there's like just a house just burning down, and it's really this haunting image of just like this emptiness, and it just slowly eats itself. It's really, really, really impressively written. Ray Bradbury does write a cut above people of the genre generally anyway. His prose is beautiful, or always interesting, so it's well worth checking out.
Well, like the next book on the list is also Ray Bradbury, which is Fahrenheit 451, which I remember loving. I read the book, and then that was one of our books we read in school. So we read the book and then watched the movie in school. I think it was 11th grade we read it, and I devoured it. It was one of my favorites. When
I was teaching, they were looking they had a thing called read time in the afternoon, where everybody in the school had to read with their tutors a certain book. And I was desperately pushing to get Fahrenheit 451 on the list, and they resisted. It is a great book of its own right. It really is actually an exciting read. We talked about Bradbury sort of being dreamlike at times, but there is a little bit of that in the way that they memorize these books.
There's a lot of tension in it as well.
Yeah.
It keeps you on the edge of your seat
Yeah.
as you move through. Now I want to read it again.
No.
Because it's marvelous. It's really, really good.
It is one of those ones that thoroughly deserves its place in canon. The next one that I've read on the list is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess.
I have not read it, but I've seen the movie.
Yeah, the movie's quite faithful. It's quite faithful to the book. I think it tones down a lot of the slang that they use. They have this own language, which is sort of based a little bit on Russian. And the first 3 or 4 times I picked up the book, I didn't get past the first page because I was just like, this is hard work. But after you get about 5-10 pages in, you stop having to look words up. You start to be able to get the gist, or you've seen the word before, and you just start to be able to read it. You learn really, really quickly this slang of this world. But it is a brutal book. It's completely unflinching, and it really deserves to have that film treatment that it got. That is so highly regarded, and people really should try to get through those first couple of pages and experience the book as well. It's all told in the first person, and this young guy's conditioned. Well, if you've seen the film, you know they try to stop him being antisocial, but in the end he reverts back, and it's just.
But did they have the milk bars?
Yeah, and it's explored a little bit more as well.
The brutality of it, for like when he was interacting with his parents, it felt like it was just our normal world. And then when he went to his gang, it felt like post-apocalyptic type of like gang violence, where they're having like street fights and they're going out and like raping people and paralyzing a man. And then like the hyper, what would you call it, mental reprogramming that they did to him. I've heard a lot of that they've actually like tried some of that with images and stuff on real life people. It was considered inhumane.
I think it's also very similar to what we did in the UK in the 50s and the 60s to try and cure people of their homosexuality and things like that were equally appalling. I think that it's based on fact to a degree, or at least these rumours that these things have been tried and tested. But the scary thing about the book is how likeable and how funny the lead character is, even though he is an absolute monster. And he'll say things like, "Oh, I saw this guy," and then we just like whip the knives out and waded in and cut off his yarbles, which is it's the slang in the book for, and it's just so matter of the fact, but it's almost like you kind of laugh out loud, and then you go, "Am I really laughing about how utterly uncaring he is about this sort of really graphic and brutal violence?" So it is an outstanding book, and I really do highly recommend it.
I'll definitely add it.
So the next one on the list is one I haven't read, but you've talked about a bit already, so I've already deduced that you have read, which is The Princess from Mars.
I have read the first 3 in that series. Yeah, I've got one that have you seen the movie at least?
I have.
I can't
find
my copy.
In all honesty, I don't remember much about it because it wasn't terribly good.
Then you know nothing about the book, so you're good. There are some similarities. Like if you've read the book, it's kind of like it's like my children read the book, and then they put on a play for me. So it was you see what they were doing, and you get like what they were trying to do, but then it just doesn't live up to what it was supposed to be. Especially the first one. The first one's definitely my favorite, Princess of Mars. It is clearly a relic of its time. The the guy's a Confederate soldier that goes out west for the gold rush and then magically is transported to Mars. We never even really figure out why. I think it was originally written as a standalone book, and then he made a bunch of money. He said, all right, I'll write 11 more. But and then it was serialized, like we talked about with possibly Foundation. It is 100% the guy goes in, fights the bad guy, can't do anything wrong, gets the girl, most beautiful girl on the entire planet, and he gets her. She falls madly in love with him. Every other woman he meets falls madly in love with him. It's just pure cotton candy fun, really, is what it is.
Have you read Tarzan?
Mm-hmm. I've read the first 2 Tarzan books as well.
I've only read the first one, but I have quite a long review of it, and I read a lot about Burroughs. The review of it was a bit of a labour of love for me. The politics of Burroughs are quite in your face. I guess you guys would call it Darwinian, because the American version of Darwinism is a little bit more like what we would call Hobbes. It's like tooth and claw, we will fight. The strongest will survive.
Yeah.
Rather than the strongest develop the skills to survive. It's a little bit a different way of, I think, of looking at your guys. Perhaps it's that we come back to the pioneer spirit of America again, that it's a little bit more cutthroat than the British.
Kind of slightly more modern, the Ayn Rand, kind of the way that you stand only on your work. You don't need anyone to support you. Your hard work makes who you are as a character or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm wondering if the politics of the Princess of Mars were left out of the film. Do you feel like?
Yes and no. A little bit, but they added a they gave the main female character, her name is Deja Thoris. They gave her a lot more agency, I guess. She wasn't a helpless damsel, and so a lot of what was not in the original book, we spend time with her, and instead of her being a helpless damsel, she is kind of fighting for her own planet and her own. It's not so much she immediately meets him, falls in love. It's more she meets him, she, brings him along as a ally instead of a savior.
Is this, like in the modern Hollywood era, it's not possible for a boy and a girl to meet and fall in love. They have to bicker and fight for a little bit first to prove that they're perfectly equal. Is there a bit of that in the film, which is not in the book?
I believe so. Yeah. There's in the book, there's an arranged marriage that they have to work around. But in the movie, it's I think there is the talk of an arranged marriage, but it never really comes to anything. In the book, he literally has, like, Martian culture, he can't kill his rival, so she loves him, but she has to marry this other man. And then, this other man, I might be getting into book 2 and 3, but it's like there's a lot of that drama. It's very much and then next week kind of because it was serialized.
Can I ask you one other question on the basis of this book, which is, does it make a difference to you that he is a Confederate soldier? Because that's obviously a deliberate choice. You have a 50-50, he's one or the other, and he's chosen that one. Do you think that there was a reason for that? Does it have any connotations? Does it bring anything to mind about that character?
So I currently live in the state of Georgia, which would be what the Confederacy was, but grew up in Florida, which doesn't, we were Confederate, but we didn't really, there wasn't a lot of people in Florida at the time. And so I never had that, Southern pride, and I didn't know much about it until I moved up here to Georgia from South Florida. Supposedly, it was heavily romanticized in the 1920s. And that's why he chose a Confederate soldier, because they were considered gentlemen of the South in the antebellum kind of era. Somebody did a really good PR job to make the Southern man seem a whole lot better than he was.
Was that a reaction to, because quite obviously the North, having won, would have their own propaganda of saying the people of the South were doing this and doing that and doing that. They were the bad people.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in truth, without knowing too much about the situation of it and not wanting to, make myself look too stupid on that regard, I kind of feel that if people go to fight, that sometimes they're not fighting for what they believed in, they're made to go. And sometimes it's still an incredible feat of bravery to go, particularly when your side is losing.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm still going to do the thing that I have to do, my duty, if you like.
That is kind of how he's presented. It's I don't believe he was a slave owner, but he fought for what a lot of people in the South consider was the great cause, the cause to be able to be free to make their own decisions. And that was kind of a changing of the narrative. Some of the South did resign for that, but a lot of it was slavery, and you can't take that out of the situation, which a lot of people were trying to do at that time, trying to say slavery was not an issue. I recently read a book, The Guns of the South, which I have right here, which basically the idea is the minute that neo-Nazis from South Africa bring AK-47s back to the Civil War, and the South wins the Civil War. It's a really interesting book. And immediately, generally, well, I'm kind of ruining it for you, but slavery starts to end. Basically, they realize this really is just not a good practice. And so it was the idea of, even if the South won the war, slavery would have ended in the 1800s. And so it's kind of that idea of, I think 2% of Southern people owned slaves. It was not common. It was the very, very rich that owned slaves. And so your common man really did not interact with African Americans. And doing a lot of research, I thought, and kind of the American idea is that everybody had a slave. It's like, we don't really get well educated about it. We just learn it's really, really bad. Southern people were bad. Northern people were good. There was a war. We fixed it. That kind of thing. And when you really dig into the minutia of it, politics was heavily about slavery because rich people influenced politics. But your general everyday Southern man did what you were talking about. They fought because they were fighting for their home. And they casually were like, I'm better than the black person, but it wasn't like a general hate. And they go into that with this book, where your average, they're like, we follow one of the main characters as a school teacher, and he's never owned a slave. He doesn't even own his own home. And he is friends with the black cook, who is a slave, but he's basically treated as one of the regiment. He's not officially a soldier in the war, but he is kind of considered one of the guys. And because he's packed horses, cooked food, done all these kind of things, he's just one of the guys, and nobody really thinks anything about it. And they're like, well, he's a good black person. They don't really put a lot of thought to it, but that's the black person that they know. And it kind of slowly in the book does that. Well, they're just like us. And so white people's minds are changing, and then they literally vote in. At one point, Nathan Bedford Forrest fights to end slavery because the neo-Nazis supported it. It's an interesting read. It's not the best book I've ever read, but it's interesting. The next book on the list, I love. I've read it multiple times.
Is it the same? Is it the same one on your list as the same one on mine, which is Ender's Game?
Yep.
Yeah.
I have not seen the new movie, though.
See, that's what I wish I hadn't done, is that I watched the movie and then read the book. And I really wish I'd read the book, because like the twist at the end, I think I would love to have come at that in the book without knowing that it was coming.
that was one of the moments. So I read it at 14, 15, 16, really when I was getting into sci-fi. Also read Dune around that time. Um, and it shook me. Like, I imagined myself as Ender, even though he's like 6 or 7 years old. I imagined myself as him because I was smart, and never really struggled in school. And then, challenges were brought to him, and he had to figure out things to do. And um, he kept getting better and better, learning from his mistakes, and then learning from the mistakes of others. Kind of one of the sayings my dad always gave me was, "Stupid people repeat their mistakes. Smart people learn from their mistakes, and then wise people learn from the mistakes of others." And it
I
was
like the
like,
end one.
so like I imagine that, around that same time, Dad was calling me stupid because I was repeating my mistakes, and I was reading Ender, and he was learning from his mistakes. He was doing all these things, and then the twist at the end, like, when I reread it 2, 3 years ago, I still cried.
Amazing. It's a great book, and it's a shame as well because like Orson Scott Card's politics have got in the way, and people are like not liking him because of something he said. I don't even know what he said particularly,
He's a Mormon, so
is
he has a strict view on homosexuality,
there you
and
go.
he believes what he believes, and you're not going to change his mind.
Shall we move on? Because we're going to
I,
skip over, as far as I can see, because I haven't read the books that they've. Samuel Delaney, that I have read books by, but not the one they picked
okay,
for the book, which is Nova. And Arthur C. Clarke, I've
yeah,
read books by, but not the one they picked for the book, which is Childhood's End. Have you read
I've
any
heard
of
that's
those?
good.
Yeah.
I own Childhood's End, and I own a couple of the 2001, um, you know, companion books that he wrote with the movie.
Mm.
Um, I watched Netflix was getting rid of some of these movies, Clockwork Orange and 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I was like, I have like 4 days left to watch these movies, so I went and watched them.
Mm.
In 2001, 2001, An Odyssey was interesting. I deeply enjoyed the movie, but I don't know if I fully understood it.
The book, I think, goes into more detail
Hmm.
and is easier to follow what the symbols and things that you're seeing are. Um, but I think in terms of pure enjoyment, the section with Hal, which is the middle part of the book, is absolutely spectacular. But the other bookends of the book, there's like that's probably only a third of it, the bit with Hal, and there's a third at the beginning, and then there's a long trip through space at the end. Those two bits are a little bit slower and laboured. But the things with the monoliths and things like that, it's all explained, and it's like this big
Hmm.
cycle of endlessly trying to create something. I won't spoil it, and I'm not entirely sure I remember it particularly well now, given how long it was since I read it. But 2001: A Space Odyssey is a really, really good book, and
Yeah,
apparently, I've heard it's a little different to the film, but I have seen the film and don't really recall there being
I think
significant differences. The
from what
things,
you're talking about, it's just things in the film are vaguely hinted at,
mm,
where in the book it probably explains them.
yeah, I think so.
Next, we go into Philip K. Dick, right?
We do, and we have two that one that we've both got reviews of on our channels, I
Hmm.
think, which is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and both of us recommend that quite
It,
highly, I
it
think.
it might be. Is Dune on here?
Yeah.
Okay, so it is in my top three of books on this list for sure.
Okay. That's
Um, I
see.
was blown away.
I think I was too. I think it's spectacular. But I think for me, I would put Ubik ahead
Hmm.
of it, which is why it wouldn't make my top three, because I would put Ubik, and we'll discuss ranking and stuff perhaps a bit later on. But I would put Ubik ahead of it. I think I just enjoyed Ubik a little bit more. I think it perhaps was a little bit quicker to get from beginning to end in terms of engaging you and making you just want to read and find out more. It's just a little bit more enjoyable. But I do think that Do Android's Dream is really thoughtful. It asks questions of like, what it is that makes you human and things like that. And it's just, I don't know, it's a book you think about a lot when you finish reading. I really enjoyed it.
I going into a little bit of my personal history. My biological father was very abusive, and so I had to go through some therapy as a kid because I struggled with feeling emotion and displaying emotion. I would fake a lot of emotions from 6 to 9, and so I look at the way that like the Mercer idea in this book and the way that the androids were just that much different. Like where she casually pulled the legs off the spider. And so I think for me personally, it hit so much on that level of, could I have been this, if I hadn't have gone to therapy, could I have been this emotionless man who may have done casually awful things because I just was not in touch with my empathetic side. So I think that's why it resonated so much with me. And then Ubik is on there, and then I have not read Ubik, but Valis I found very, very strange. Is the other book I've read by him. And then you said you read Man in the High Castle as well,
I did,
which
yeah.
I have not read.
Yeah, I found Man in the High Castle, I said, like, disappointing, but only because I expected so much of it. And it's still decent. And I think that the three that I've read from Philip K. Dick, which are Ubik, Man in the High Castle, and Do Androids Dream, they must be his most accessible ones, because everything I've heard from everything else is like, I read this one and it was insane and I didn't understand any of it, and it was like a really trippy or whatever, and everybody's like, oh yeah, I read this one and didn't get it, or I read this one and
Yeah.
So I think I've just been really lucky to pick the three, but then at the same time they were all made into films, or well, Ubik wasn't, but the other two were, so they kind of have that curiosity value as well that makes you want to read and see what's about. Down to the next one for me, which is William Gibson. Is there
I have not.
anything?
I own this book, Neuromancer, but I have not read it.
Okay.
And then I read The Lost World, which you own a copy of.
I do. Let me just, because that is a really beautiful copy.
Yeah, that is a great copy.
Yeah. So yeah, I haven't read it.
I was telling you that I read a bunch of classics that way. I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Lost World, Journey to the Center of the Earth. And it was these, in America they had this great illustrated classics, which was a hardcover with no dust jacket and heavily abridged and super easy to read. But so I have not read the unabridged version, but I've read that abridged version when I was younger. It was good.
It seems like that's a good gateway to the classics. If it makes you want to see what the real full text is about, then I think I'm in favour, particularly for making it accessible to younger children. But Neuromancer,
What'd you think of it?
I have a review and it's there for people if they want to see it, but I have a real love of the look, the sound, the feel of cyberpunk, and Gibson was so integral to that, and Neuromancer particularly, that I enjoy that part of his book, but I sometimes find that perhaps character and plot isn't as strong, and that's why I think what I felt about Neuromancer is that it was a little bit like, I just don't care enough about the people in it, but the world itself is incredible, and you can see why it would be so influential and like spawn movies and role-playing games in this whole cyberpunk movement. And there's a great video on YouTube about the genesis of the cyberpunk movement, which I really highly recommend. So I do recommend the book, but I don't think it's quite, I don't think it's on this list because of its quality as a story or an entertaining piece of art. It's there for its influence on the genre, I think. There might even be one of those ones that if I was to make a case like, what are your criteria for drawing up this list, it might be one of those ones where I'd be like, well, perhaps this one doesn't come up to the standard of some of these others, like Do Androids Dream, Ubik, and things like that are just superior in terms of being able to enjoy them and also still having something to say.
Doesn't he have another one too that either a sequel to that one or
Yeah.
another highly regarded sci-fi book?
I think
I
he
can't
has.
remember what it's called.
I think he has 2 or 3 that are like really
Yeah.
highly. I have Mona Lisa Overdrive, which
That
is
was
which
it.
is
That was the
quite
one I was
famous.
thinking of. Yeah.
But that has this. I feel exactly the same about that as I do about Neuromancer. Aside from, I would say that Neuromancer is probably the pick of the 2.
Okay.
I've read I read 3 or 4 of his, in fact, and I find that they make me want to write science fiction rather than make me love his science fiction. So for me, I've got nothing now until we get down to Heinlein. How about yourself?
Same. Now, speaking of Heinlein, Starship Troopers is the only one that I've read by him, and I've recently read it and loved it. But one that we do skip over is The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, which is very much compared to Starship Troopers, kind of the anti-Starship Troopers. And that's high on my list to read soon. But yeah, I love this book.
I think for me that the issue with Starship Troopers is that the balance between the story and Heinlein's soapbox is starting to tilt. Whereas before, I think that he had really had a phenomenal focus on story. And then if I can get a little bit of politics in, a little bit of my viewpoint in, then I will. But I think that he was starting to lose a little bit of faith, really, in the American direction of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Starship Troopers was like, this is how we get things put back on track. And in that regard, again, just like Neuromancer, hugely influential, not just in the fact that you talked about the Forever War and stuff like that, like the response to it, that it was influenced the other side of politics, if you like, to have their say, but also things like the powered armor and the stuff like that is just like everywhere now in science fiction. Hugely influential. It is still, as Johnny Rico's story, I think, an enjoyable story. It's not completely skewed, like I'm just banging on and hectoring, political hectoring, and telling you what should be happening and what shouldn't be happening, which is what some people will tell you about it. I think there is still a story there. It's not quite as engaging a story as something like Double Star or The Star Beast or Puppet Masters, or even perhaps Methuselah's Children, which is the first like Lazarus long book. But in that regard, again, it comes down to criteria. What criteria are we using to make this a must-read? Science fiction that creates some sort of reaction in a reader. Starship Troopers will do that, which is what I always say when I recommend it. So you might not love it, but you will have a reaction to it. And that's why I always recommend it. So I kind of don't mind it being on the list, but in terms of Heinlein, there's more enjoyable options. The other option... Sorry.
What is your favorite Heinlein, since we're on Heinlein?
Probably is the Puppet Masters. I have a video which is like the most popular video on my channel, which is like 5 of the best by Heinlein, which occasionally gets quite a lot of downvotes. And I put on there things like Methuselah's Children is on there.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of good things about Methuselah's Children.
And Puppet Masters is on there. And trying to think, because when I did it, I hadn't read Star Beast or Double Star, and I think that I would probably put Star Beast on there as well now in like the top 3. However, the other Heinlein that they chose in the book is a book called Orphans of the Sky, which might be different in America to what it is in the UK, because in the UK that's a collection of 2 short stories, which are Universe and Common Sense, which are 2 really, really good short stories. But it's almost like it's a collection of short stories rather than a novel. So if I'm saying this is a must-read novel, is it even a novel? And they only, in their review of it, in the book, only actually mention universe. They don't mention common sense at all. So I'm wondering if perhaps they have a different volume. So it's like I probably wouldn't have put that on there because I probably wouldn't have counted it as a novel. I would have counted it as 2 shorts. Okay. But Universe is, like Starship, is incredibly influential. If you read Universe, you'll start to think, oh yeah, I've seen that in Star Trek. I've seen that in Battlestar Galactica and Deep Space Nine and all the other stuff. Is like they've all copied it. It's a really common idea now. This idea that they have this seed ship, like a colonial ship, going a really huge distance, and they expect the humans to go through generations as they travel. But the problem is that humans go through generations, and eventually they believe that there is nothing outside of the ship that they're traveling on. So you'll have seen Star Trek. I think there's an episode of Star Trek where they find that ship, and it's exactly the same, and then they have to try to convince them that the ship's in danger, but they won't have it because they have this religious faith, if you like, that there is nothing else but the ship. So that idea has become quite common. And
one of the books that's not on here that I have on my list of books that should be is Wool by Hugh Howey, which is they're in a silo, and they believe the silo is the only thing left on the planet. And then their slow realization that they're not the only people left on the planet. So yeah, a very similar idea that we've done before.
Okay. So if we move on from Heinlein, the next one on the list is Dune.
This was my favorite book for probably 20 years, 25 years. And was only recently unseated as my favorite book by a book that's not on here, which is Hyperion. Which Hyperion is not on this list, and I think it should be.
It might be, if Hyperion is new, it might have come out after this book. We don't know.
1990.
Oh, well, definitely not then, because this book's from the 2000s, and this thing is on the list. So, okay. So, what made you love Dune so much?
I think it's the way the story was told. It was the idea of, as we talked about the Bene Gesserit, the genetic manipulation of humanity to a point where finally, actually before it was supposed to be, a perfect human was created. And then this perfect human doesn't know he is what he is. And there's this ginormous chemical substance called the spice melange. And it changes perception, like mentally. Like space travel is possible because the pilots are able to see enough of the future to avoid collisions, like light speed collisions in space. Like that's how they use spice to travel at faster light travel. And that's I have read the first 3 books in the series twice, and then Dune 4 times, I believe. It's just marvelous.
I mean, I have read Dune twice before and loved it, and I'm just rereading it again as we speak and just trying to pick out my thoughts about it. But I remember just thinking it's an absolute masterpiece. And as I was reading it again, I was kind of like, is this going to disappoint me? Because I remember it so fondly, but my tastes have changed since I read it. I would have been a younger man, and now I'm, perhaps older, a bit wiser, a bit more educated. But I have to say that it's actually better than I remember it being, because there are things like there's a scene where the Duke has arrived on Arrakis and he has a dinner with some aides and some people, and just the tension through that whole scene is all created, and it's just building and building and building the whole way through, and you're just like, this is people sitting around a table, this should be incredibly dull, but I'm completely hooked by it. And it's little things like Dr. Yui, they tell us that he's going to betray them, and yet every school of storytelling would be, don't telegraph that. make that a surprise, make that a shock to your reader, because then they're absolutely going to be hooked in by, oh my God, I did not see that coming. But at the same time, it gives this real weight to what's happening, that you know what's coming. It's like the dramatic irony of knowing that what the characters don't. And it's told to you so many times, like the little footnotes and the inserts from the princess, they tell you so many times, so you know it's coming. But it just adds
You
more
have that
and more.
hope that maybe it doesn't happen, but it's told to you. Stephen King does this a lot. It's like subverting. I don't know. I don't know why. Like, it's one of my complaints about Stephen King, but I think Frank Herbert does it better than King has ever done it.
I think that I like Stephen King. We read a lot of his books and enjoy them, but I think that Frank Herbert. I mean, people might say, "Oh, you haven't read," because I've only read the first one of the Towers. I can't remember what it's called. I haven't read any of the others.
The Dark Tower?
The Gunslinger ones. Yeah, I've only read the first one.
I just finished that.
People might say, "Oh, you haven't read that," but for me, that Herbert is a more sophisticated writer in not just his plots, but his characters and just like everything. Even his prose is just on a different level. I did quite like The Gunslinger, the first one. Not enough that I was like, I must go out and get more. But
the second Dark Tower book is personally monumentally better. It, like, you go from an interesting book that I probably gave 2.5, 3 stars, and like I got some downvotes on that video when I started talking about it, because people were like, "Why do you not like this book?" And then I went to book 2, and it was like I was gonna quit the series if that book was not good, and it demolished my expectations.
Would you consider it science fiction?
Yes and no. It's a multi-dimensional dying Earth story. So some of the dimensions are forward in time, some of the dimensions are backwards in time. Some of them have gone so far that they've started over. It's very, very interesting.
Sounds zany, for want of a better word. But then King, something like The Dead Zone, I think, might count as science fiction. That is a good book. But there's no King on the list. That was just why I asked the question. He's not on this list at all. And you think,
I have one book by him that I think should be added, but there's probably others as well.
Which one do you think should be added?
The Stand.
Okay. I've not read that one.
It's about a super flu, which is very relevant now. But the way the story is told, I found it riveting. I read probably 100 pages a day. I just couldn't stop reading it. Like, I had to remove it from beside the bed because I couldn't get any sleep. It was that kind of. It was very good.
Yeah, it might be one to check out. I've had other people say that it's, outstanding in terms of this catalog.
I found a original copy, which is only like 853 pages. Most of the copies you'll find now is over 1,000 pages. He added a few things, which, from what I'm told, you don't really need. Kind of a little bit more shock and gore. So I would recommend the shorter version, but I don't know if you can find it.
we passed Heinlein, but I have the shorter version as well as the longer version of Stranger in a Strange Land, and would recommend the shorter version. Okay, so if we're going to move on from June, we're skipping over people like Huxley and Ursula Le Guin, who I've read books by, but not their choices here. Is there any? I'm going down to Matheson for I Am Legend, but any of those that you've read in that?
So personally, I have not read I Am Legend. I own it, but I haven't read it. But I started Brave New World and was not as... I read it right after 1984, and I didn't find it as engaging, so I stopped reading it. And then one of the other books I read in school was Flowers for Algernon, which was a very, very good book. It's about a man who is mentally retarded. He's a janitor at the research facility, and they're doing the tests on a mouse, and the mouse gets smarter and smarter and smarter the more of the medicine he takes. And so they decide, I can't remember if they're not allowed to do human trials or if they just like him and they choose him, but he starts taking the medicine and he goes from mentally retarded to competent to genius level smart. And it ends on a devastating note. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but it's high and high and high and high, and then the main character finds out something that wrecks him, and you're left thinking, how would I handle this moment? How would I handle this situation? How it's definitely worth being on this list for sure.
Okay, I've put it on my list. I might see if I can find a copy of that. Sounds interesting. I have got a copy of Solaris by Lem and Left Hand of Darkness by Le Guin. Just haven't got around to reading either of those, but we have skipped over Matheson, so I'm going to just go back. I Am Legend, other than the fact that it is post-apocalypse, I don't really see the sci-fi, because it is vampires, it's horror, it's survival, post-apocalypse, but beyond that, so in that regard, again, it's like, what is the criteria for this list? However, it is a really, really good book, and it is really short as well. It's basically not far off a novella, so you will be able to read it really rapidly. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe here, and to Ramsey, I'll put a link to his channel in the description. Part 2 of this discussion is coming soon. Hopefully I'll see you then. Bye.